acknowledge, first of all, my co-author, Charlotte Hedwall, and other people that have kind of borrowed from the work that we've done previously. Hunter, Cal Ferris, Xander, Chuck Maxwell, Megan. Let me see. All right. So here's kind of the, I'm going to be really focused in on the Southwest. So here's kind of some work that Megan Polling has been doing in the Southwest in terms of looking at MTBS and high severity fire and fire in general in the Southwest since 1984. So you can kind of see that, you know, her basic conclusion is that there's the amount of high severity is increasing, and the fire areas is increasing over time. So we've all known this for a long time, so the question has become, like, what can we do about it? For a long time, it seems like we really focused in on treatments. Mechanical treatments was essentially what would be the fire plan, like Dave was talking about. But we've all known that's a stand level kind of solution, and really the real solution kind of lied at the landscape level. That's what we needed to do. And so little by little, we've been going to this managed fire, multiple objectives. You know, hopefully somebody's going to clarify that after me. But this idea of not full suppression, but a more of a managed fire approach. In the Southwest, we can see that, you know, from this graph, this is actually from Chuck Maxwell, put this together last week, and you can kind of see that starting in 2002, there is a kind of an increase in managed fire in the Southwest. And then it really has taken off in the last 2 years, 2015, 2016. We've seen a lot of area burn in the Southwest. The Southwest has really been one of the more adaptive regions in terms of using managed fire. And it's actually even more clear in terms of when you look at the number of incidents. So here on the y-axis, there's no labels there, but it's the number of incidents that have been managed in different responses. So suppression is red. The green is multiple objectives or wildfire use, whatever, managed fire is what I call it. And you can kind of see that, you know, it's been used in the 90s. Most of the work in the 90s was probably the Gila and some of those isolated wilderness areas. But it really starts picking up after 2002. You know, you start seeing more incidents being managed with something other than full suppression. And then it really takes off in 2009 with a new policy that comes into place. And then you can kind of see that for the Southwest, the 2015 and 2016 is really the big year. That's when it kind of comes out of the wilderness area and into more mainstream. You know, the Kaibab, the Coconino, everybody starts adapting it. You know, and so it becomes more widely used across the Southwest. This idea of too much fire is interesting because if you talk to most fire people, they would argue that there is no such thing as too much fire. We have a fire deficit out here. There's not enough fire. So this too much fire idea, you know, essentially comes a little bit, I hate to say it, but from non-fire people. And it really kind of talks to the idea that we don't have a social license yet. I mean, we are working on it, but we don't have it yet. When you talk about social fire, we've got to look at the ecological aspects of it, the economic aspects, and the social aspects. And just a note here, this is the map I show here, is really the pumpkin fire in 2000 in the kind of Coconino, the Kaibab area. And you can kind of see that at the bottom end of the fire is kind of blacked out. And that was essentially one of the first times I ever saw this idea of box and burn, where you kind of box out some areas, and then you just let the fire do its thing, coming off the mountain. So this was 2002. So in terms of economics, there's you know, no matter what kind of fire we put out there, there's always going to be some economic consequences to it. This is actually part of the Sierra Ancha experimental forest in Arizona, and there was a managed fire there this year, the juniper fire. And even though the severity was really not that high in that area, you still had an economic loss. This cost the $100,000 in damage. So even though it's a managed fire, there's still going to be some economic consequences to it. So that's something that we should always consider. And then in terms of social kind of aspect, in terms of social aspects, the big one is smoke. I think that's kind of the one that we have some a social license for smoke. There's people that are willing to tolerate it, but they have a kind of a threshold, I think, there. This is actually the Sitgrace managed fire in the Kaibab. but we had the Catalinas had a number of managed fires this year. They were pretty successful until they smoked out Sedona, and then they kind of had to shut them down. So people are willing to tolerate it, but there is a threshold there. Again, the economic issues and the social issues, I'm not an expert in that, so I just kind of wanted to acknowledge that those are out there, and there's probably people that can really speak to those a little bit better than I can. What I can kind of speak, and I'm going to focus on a little bit more, is this idea of the ecological too much fire. And the first one that comes to my mind is too much high severity, you know? There's this idea that we can put fire out there, but it has too much severity, that could have some significant ecological impacts. However, at the same time, when you talk about high severity, you can talk about it in terms of metrics like percent high severity, but the one I like to focus in is on patch size. So here we have an area that we stem mapped. This is an area in the pumpkin fire. It's a rectangle that's 200 meters by 200 meters, so it's actually 4 hectares or 10 acres. And the red here are trees that survive the fire, and then the open circles are dead trees. So you can kind of see that in the middle there's an area that kind of got blown out, a little patch of about 4 acres. But then the regeneration came back in there. So the area is showing some resilience. So small patches, I think that we shouldn't really worry about too much. In fact, some of these patches, for example, in the Catalinas, just outside our door here, this area burned in 2003, and the regeneration in the high severity patches is this kind of that hyper dense kind of regeneration that Joan Mast and Savage have talked about. So essentially, that could actually be a problem. But there are other places where regeneration after high severity fire is not as hyper dense. This is actually an area in the Pumpkin Fire in northern Arizona by Flagstaff that burned in 2000, and the regeneration is coming in. One of the aspects that I wanted to show here is those down logs. It seems like when you talk to fuels people, they're kind of anti-down logs. You know, they want to get rid of those fuels. But it seems to me like that those fuels are really an important aspect in terms of regeneration, and that's something that we might want to kind of consider as we're managing these fires, especially with managed fire where we have the choice of whether we're going to burn this type of area or not. And because what happens if we burn these areas? Well, a number of things can happen. For example, this is an area that burned in 1996 in the Horseshoe Aquifer around Flagstaff, and then it burned again in 2014. And that fire consumed all the logs and killed all the regeneration that was a couple of years old. So it can be pretty devastating, kind of reset the system a little bit. But there's also other instances where I've seen where the second fire actually kind of goes through and thins out the area. So again, it's kind of like Tom Swetnam was talking about yesterday. There is a duality here there's no one size fits all. And so we should be kind of monitoring these areas and trying to learn from them as much as possible. Because one of the things that we can't afford to do is that these fires have come through some of these areas and kind of thinned them out, and so we have to get in there and start and not just take that for granted, but kind of introduce the process, which is the frequent fire process. So this is actually an area in the Gila that's had a number of fires. You can kind of see the open structure in that forest. But at the same time, when you have areas that have had fire, and some high severity fire and some low severity fire, you have these islands. And so when you manage fire, you got to be really conscious of this, and that you don't kind of burn those islands. Those islands can be very important. And for example, the Grand Canyon, Colin Caffey showed a picture yesterday about some of these landscapes where you have these islands of refugia that get killed in that second fire. So we got to be careful when we make these decisions in terms of managing these fires. Another idea is this idea that we might be going too fast, too much fire, too quick. If you look at the last 2 years in the Southwest, this is a kind of a frequency diagram. So on the left-hand side along the y-axis is the number of fires, and on the x-axis is kind of how big those fires were. So you can kind of see that in the last 2 years, there's been a lot of managed fire, multiple objectives fire, but most of them have been relatively small. Most of them, 65 fires in the last 2 years, have been under 5,000 acres. But there are some fires kind of on that far right side where we have managed some fires in the Southwest that are 30,000, 40,000 acres, which is pretty big, pretty good chunk of land that we're burning. And the reason I think that could potentially be a little too much is because I've done some work with Molly Hunter and Calvin Ferris in the Gila, And the Gila is one of those areas, kind of like Saguaro, Grand Canyon, some of like that have had this tool, that have been using this tool of managed fire for a long time. They essentially started using it in the 1970s. You can kind of see in the 1970s, even though that they were using the tool, they were very cautious about it. In fact, when Saguaro started using it, their rule of thumb was to wait until they got two inches of precipitation up in the mountain before they would allow fire to burn. So they were very cautious at first. And what that bottom is, a bottom capacity. It allowed people to kind of get comfortable with this idea of allowing fire to burn. And that also created landscape heterogeneity within those areas that were burning. So you can kind of see in the Gila, same thing. 70s, you see fires, but there's not 20,000, 30,000 acre fires. They're actually starting small. But then by the 80s, they start creating that capacity. They start kind of the landscape heterogeneity, that puzzle that the people from San Carlos were talking about, that starts to get developed, and people get more comfortable with it. By the 90s, the area is burning a lot more. Those puzzles are coming together, and the area is really kind of starting to take off. And then by the 2000s, you know, they're burning landscape level. And essentially, that kind of a pattern, that kind of scale is what we all want to get to. But I think we gotta get there slowly. We gotta learn from what we're doing and take it easy. And I think you know, within a decade, I think that we can get there. But we should be a little bit cautious, I think. So you can see that the Gila is an area that is burned 5 times. You're going to see landscape heterogeneity. You're going to see some high severity patches that are recovering, but with time, the landscape will kind of look better. But we have to have a little bit of patience with this new tool. And lastly, I'd like to close with this idea that we need to monitor what we're doing. I think that what we're like the potential for change using managed fire is great. We could be changing landscapes. And yet, at the same time, we're planning for them, but we're not planning a lot of monitoring. So a lot of times, you know, you see these reports that we're managing for ecological objectives, and yet we don't have that much data to back that up. And I think that that's really important to have that data and that knowledge, because there could be unintended consequences, and we want to identify those consequences as quickly as possible, especially when you're managing and you're burning this much area. It could potentially be catastrophic in the long term, and we can't afford that, especially with climate change coming down. The other thing I think that monitoring could potentially buy us is this idea of social license. I think that idea of social license, I think, is really important, and to move forward, we need that social license. And I think I myself am a researcher, and I think that this is where research can potentially really play an important part in showing the importance and the benefit of these managed fires, and kind of try to convince people that yes, you're going to have to smell smoke for a couple of weeks in the summertime, but there's an ecological benefit, and and the value of that benefit is actually is worth your inhaling that smoke for a little bit. And with that, I'll take a couple of questions, although I do have to give another talk in 2 minutes.